I'm Dr. Rob Lawson. I am a history professor here. I also direct the honors program. My research area is mostly like early 20th century American cultural history, but I've been a dean for 18 years now, and when we celebrated our 140th anniversary in 2005, I was commissioned to take on and learn the history of the college. And that has been a gift that's been giving ever since in the last 16 years. We do a lot of tours like this. We do some historical blogging. We have lots of events for faculty and staff who come into the community, and we do history events for them so they can take part and begin to share in this long history we have. And then we do some stuff in coursework as well. So students like Annabelle and Dylan who are here in History 101. This is a course that we actually look specifically at Dean history and use all the rich material around us as sources. And so that project starts Monday, by the way. So I'll be telling you about that. In class. So to get us started, everybody should have one of these nice packets, and I want to really say thanks to Jackie here for helping out, getting us ready for today.
Of course, thank you, Dr. Lawson.
Yes, Jackie and I have been doing a couple of projects. We both are bird lovers too. So if there's any interesting birds along the way of the tour today, we can stop and identify them and have some fun. So we've got these wonderful packets that Jackie made for us, and these images are going to help, add to the words that I have to share, and we're going to be able to stand in some of the places where these photos were taken in the past. And so this way you'll be able to really feel that history. First thing I want to do is bring us over here and look at the college seal. So if you'll follow me, and you'll notice the AD 1865, so that's the year of the founding. The forte et fidele nihil difficile, that's the Latin phrase that I think some of the students or alumni may know. Test, it's time for a quiz. Forte et fidele, the strength and fidelity, or faithful. Strong and faithful, nihil difficile, nothing impossible, nothing too difficult. So for the strong and faithful, nothing's too tough for us as Dean Bulldogs. We are the Bulldogs, obviously, not the Lions, but you see the two lions there. So that whole center part of the seal, and that goes along with our first picture, which is our founder, of course, Dr. Oliver Dean. He was a medical doctor. He didn't spend much of his life actually in medicine. He got out of medicine relatively early, and he joined into the movement of the Industrial Revolution, and he became a mill supervisor and mill owner. If anybody from around Manchester, New Hampshire area, you'll know the Amoskeag mills and all those other mills that are right along the Merrimack. Those were the mills that he was managing, and he became very wealthy doing that. That is the seal of his family, which came from Cornwall, southwest England. There's a town there, Chard, C-H-A-R-D, and that is where the Dean family came from. They used to spell it with an E on the end, but that is the Dean family seal. Now, I don't think Dean would have known about that when he was, born as a farmer's son growing up here in Franklin. I mean, they weren't impoverished, but they certainly weren't lording over the land. I think that he found out about that seal later after he became wealthy and then kind of adapted it. But that's the seal, so that's why we have that. Yeah, the red lions are traditional to the family, but we have them as part of her. So it's like our second mascot, I guess you could say. The Bulldogs and the Red Lions, we've got them. So that's a little bit about Oliver Dean. He wasn't the only person that had an important influence on creating and sustaining this institution, which started as a boarding school academy in the 1860s. It became a college in the 1940s, so it spent the first 80 so years of its history as an academy. But Dean wasn't the only person who had a hand in that. The people that built the two houses you see on image number 2 on the next page, they played an important role as well. And for that, we've got to walk around the building. So we've got a nice sidewalk here that's going to take us to the other side of the campus center. And let's head over that way and we'll continue the story there. So if you look at picture number 2, now we're not standing exactly in the place. In fact, we're a little bit off center. This lithograph would have been created from the perspective of the corner right down there, because the building that's in the foreground, the one on the left, is the Ray House, or what we know as admissions. So that means that as you look at that image, you can see they were matchy-matchy mansions. A couple things are different. One is that it no longer has the cupola up on the top, though you can still see the chimney. And then obviously the other thing is the other mansion's missing. It's not there anymore. So these were the matchy-matchy mansions of Joseph and James Ray. They were brothers. They were industrialists. They made a lot of money in the textile and felt industry. Some of the factory buildings, the old mills that exist here in Franklin still today, were the mills that they ran. Some of those are down on Union Street. So if you're familiar with where the railway tracks cross Union Street, they had some mills right there, and then some others further on the western edge of town. Anyway, they made a lot of money in textiles. They had war contracts with the War Department during the Civil War, and they were providing felt blankets to the Union Army. And some of you may know there were about 1 million men in the Union Army by 1865, so that's a lot of blankets that were shipped down to Washington, D.C., and a lot of treasury checks that came up, and that's what led to these mansions. And so the Ray brothers and the daughters of Joseph Ray, so in the house that would have been there, that burned in the 1990s, the daughters of Joseph Ray and Emily Lockwood, they were Annie Ray and Lydia Ray. They had quite a role to play in this town philanthropically. In fact, if you flip over now to image 3, you see the caption, Mrs. Arthur W. Peirce, Lydia Ray, that was her maiden name, just going down Main Street here in her carriage. And she was quite a benefactor to this town, and as were her parents. And we're going to find out later that this family really contributed a lot, not only to Dean, but to the town in general. So it's good to take a pause, because any of you who are students now or alumni, you know that building. It was like a starting point for your Dean journey. So the Rays are important. If we imagine the street now, and you're all familiar, especially the current students, with the little cuckoo signal, cuckoo, cuckoo, that we're going to hear again in just a few moments as these folks cross. So this is the sound of every day here on Main Street, right? The cars going over the sidewalk, the beep, beep, beep of the thing. But if you go back 100 years and more, then the image you see, number 4, is, think of the sound you would hear thinking about those trolleys that you see in the image number 4. So this photograph is actually taken from just right about here and looking down toward Main Street. You can't really see it in the image, but through that tunnel of trees is right downtown Franklin on Main Street. And so these trolleys were running up and down this street all the time, and you might be saying, like, where could you go? You could get to all of the local towns and villages. So you could go to Bellingham, Medway, you could go to Wrentham, you could go down to Attleboro. You could go anywhere practically on these trolleys, because all the little towns and villages were interconnected. But then Henry Ford began to mass produce automobiles very cheaply, and the petroleum industry got up and running with John Rockefeller, and so a whole new mode of transportation and a whole new way of getting around was introduced to America. And of course that's the automobile. So the trolley lines were torn up, and we still of course have our larger rail line that goes into Boston on the MBTA. And that was used in the past for things like dairy delivery. They'd come out on the trains in the morning and pick up the milk from all of the dairy farms that were out here and bring it into the city of Boston. Also, we had a number of ice ponds. And these ponds are still around here. They just aren't used for harvesting ice anymore. But in those days, prior to refrigeration, that was really important. They'd come out and they'd cut the squares of ice from the ponds and put them on the train, and off they went. So people could have that for their ice boxes. So the transportation network is an interesting thing to think about. And this was right at the heart of a lot of that right here. So we know about the Rays, we know about Dean a little bit, we know about how the landscape here has changed. Let's walk up toward the library here and we'll continue our story. So welcome to the Franklin Public Library. This is a beautiful, beautiful building inside and out. Speaking of the Ray family, so the two daughters that I mentioned, Annie Ray and Lydia Ray, who you saw in her carriage, when they inherited the family wealth and they inherited the mansions, they started to spread the money all around town. And they built the original firehouse that was renovated a few years ago. They built a public school back in this direction that unfortunately burned down. They built a few things here on campus that we'll talk about, but I think for the town the most notable thing was the Ray Memorial Library here. The daughters had gone to Italy on vacation, and they were quite impressed with Italian art and architecture. So when they came back, they wanted to build some Italian stuff. So they built this neoclassical building in 1904. And inside is beautiful Italian marble, and you have a lot of really quality woodwork and murals. So it's really worthwhile going inside. It's just if any of you have spent time like at the New York Public Library or at the Boston Library in Copley Square, it's got that kind of feel. It's very rich. And for those of you who are students, if you're not using it as a study space, I encourage you to do so. It's a great place. Dean students are totally welcome here. You can check out books using your Dean ID. And you can just enjoy the quiet and beautiful space. So I encourage you to use it. Also, there's a reason why there's a Ben Franklin statue here. It's not just random. So this town is, of course, Franklin, and there's an interesting story to that. Originally, these lands were in between several of the important Native American tribes and nations that occupied southern New England, like the Wampanoags down toward the Cape, and the Massachusetts Indians toward Boston. The Nipmuc tribe could be found on the road up to Worcester, and the Narragansetts down in Rhode Island. And this area was kind of in between all those different Indian nations. And when the English came, they staked a claim to this as part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So this was not part of the Plymouth colony, this was part of Mass Bay, and as such it was incorporated into the village of Wrentham. But during the American Revolution, when people were feeling the spirit of independence, the folks in this part of Wrentham said we should have our own town, and this was in the 1770s. So they petitioned the General Court of Massachusetts, and they earned the right to have their own town, and they were originally going to call it Exeter, a old English type name. And some people were like, why, we're breaking away from England. Why are we naming towns after English stuff? So somebody here got the bright idea, and they're like, hey, Ben Franklin's rich. Let's ask him for some money. And we'll tell him we'll name the town after him. So he was over in Paris negotiating with the French. Some of you know that the French came in to help the American colonists during the war. So he was over there. They wrote him a letter and they're like, Dr. Franklin, we want to name a town after you, but if you'd send us some money, we could get a beautiful bell for our town meeting house. And Franklin is very shrewd, so he's like, no, 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 I'm not sending you people money so that you can have a bell. And he wrote back quite famously, and he said that sense is preferable to sound. So instead what he did make a gift. He wrote to a bookseller in London with a list of books and said, please send these to this new town in Massachusetts that's going to be named Franklin. And they sent the books. The books had a long and interesting journey. At one point they were in a barn, but now they live in a $20,000 climate-controlled glass case.
Wow.
And you can go and see them. They're in the library. You can't take them out and read them, but they're in this case, and they are protected for perpetuity now. And those were the gifts that led to this being the first town in the United States named Franklin. And now if you go all around the country, you'll see Franklins all over the place. But this was the first one, and that's why. So the library is the oldest public library in the US. The building is not. Again, the building dates to 1904, but the books go all the way back to 1778. And so, yeah, I really encourage you to go in and check out the library. From this perspective as well, we can look over to the next couple of images. In fact, I'm going to suggest that you skip over to number 6, because that photograph was taken right about from here. And it's looking in that direction. And so you think, wow, that church looks a little different now. As many of you know, that's our library learning commons. It's also where my office is. And fantastic space. Is a huge renovation that's going on right now. It's getting closer to complete. It's going to be very student-oriented space. Great for studying, collaboration, working with each other, working with faculty. So that's all happening. But that's what it used to be. So it was a Universalist church. If you look on this photo, up in the tree line, you'll see a little cross. And that would be the cross that topped Dean Hall. And I'll have to explain a little bit more later, like why that's not there. But in any event, that church was built by Oliver Dean. He was a strong believer in the Universalist cause. The Universalists later joined with the Unitarians, so you know them today as the Universalist Unitarians, or as my friends who are in that church call it, the UUs. So that's an easy way to remember, the UUs. So Oliver Dean was a Universalist. That meant that he did have to break with the religious traditions of this community, which were the puritanical traditions, the Congregational church. So this was a breakaway movement, and he founded the church, built the church in 1856 when he came back to Franklin after retiring from New Hampshire with all the money he had made in the mills, and he started building things. So you can see it there. There's another image that we'll check out of the original one. It did suffer a fire and have to be rebuilt. That's image number 5, but we can look at that when we cross over. If you look at number 7, you'll see the construction of the library. That happened in the 1960s when the baby boomers started to show up on campus, and they needed a lot more space. So lots of dorms got built. The campus center was constructed, the science building, the library, lots of stuff, Perry Gym, lots of stuff got built in the 60s as the baby boomers came. It was devastating to people in the town when the church was demolished. I've talked to some of the older residents and some of the older alumni, people who had gotten married in that church, you know, people who had been going to services there. It was a pretty devastating moment. I was given some oral histories of people describing the steeple coming crashing down, and it was a pretty tragic moment for people. But as a resident of the building that was put in its place, I hope we're doing Dr. Dean justice still. I think so. But that was one of the more radical changes on campus, along with the 1998 burning of the Purse House, or the second Ray Mansion, that led to this beautiful edifice of Woodward Hall. So now you know about Franklin, you know about the libraries. Let's head over to what gets called Front Campus, or our main quad. We're more or less now where photograph number 5 was taken. That was the original Universalist church. What I find really interesting about this photo, first of all, you can see somebody playing tennis right there in front. And so this was our athletic space as well. All the athletics happened out here on this field. And I'll say a little more about that in a few minutes. The other thing I want to point out about this photograph is you'll see a brick building behind the church. That would be where the Ginley Funeral Home is today. That was in fact a straw factory. Well, they didn't make straw there, that grows in the field, but they worked, it's like Willy Wonka or something. But they worked with the straw and they made lots of different things. But the most popular things that they made were hats and bonnets. And if you think about, like, especially if you're from around here, think about like image of, let's say, like Fenway Park in 1915. Can you imagine when all the men would wear those flat straw hats? Those were made, like so many of those were made here in Franklin. They also made straw bonnets for ladies. But those hats became hugely popular and in fact became a real lifeblood to this town for a while. So much so that if you go to the Franklin History Museum, which is over on Central Street, it's the old meeting house, beautiful white building, you'll see a bronze statue out in front of the town museum, and it's a boy, and he's got a dog with him, but he's tipping a straw cap. And that is like homage to the long period of time when the straw production was a really big deal here. So that was a straw factory. These straw mills were all over the place. There were some over on the other side of campus, and yeah, dotting around the Franklin landscape were these small manufactories. Where we are now is about where photo number 8 was taken. And as you look at Dean Hall today, well, first of all, you see the trees are very small, just saplings basically. This is a photo I want to thank a friend of mine here in town named Joe Landry. He grew up here in Franklin. He lives in Attleboro now, but he's become one of the great historical assets to this town. He is retired and he spends a lot of time doing research on the history of Franklin. And it's because of people like him that we know a lot of what we know. As a professional historian, I am so thankful for the people in all the communities who are so passionate about their local history, and they invest their time and their talent in doing really nitty-gritty research. And Joe uncovered this photograph. I'd never seen it before. Hardly anybody who I know had seen this before. And I love this photo because it's such an interesting view right at the beginning of Dean Academy, when the building was brand spanking new. This building was designed by Thomas Silloway, who also designed, his most famous creation would be the Vermont State Capitol building up in Montpelier. So if you've been there and seen that building, same architect. And he designed about 400 buildings here on the East Coast. You'll notice that there's some similarity, but there's some real differences too. If you look at the layout of the windows, you'll notice that's the same. But the roof line is totally different, right? And no tower. So this was the original Dean Hall. It was constructed beginning in 1866. They finished it in 1868. And sadly, it only lived for 4 years. In 1872, a fire broke out up on the 4th or 5th floor, and they couldn't contain the fire. Fortunately, everybody was able to get out, They were able to rescue a lot of the materials as well. Expensive things like woven carpets and some furnishings. They tried to get everything out of the building as they could, but the building couldn't be saved, and so it was reduced to rubble. We have letters and diaries of students who lived through that, and their description of the foundation being like an open barbecue pit or like a volcano. And to see a building of that size on fire, I think would have been rather dramatic. Especially given that if you look at the vista, it was kind of out here on a plain. Right? This had all been a farm, actually, owned by the Reverend Nathaniel Emmons, for whom Emmons Street right here is named. I could tell you a lot about him, but that'll have to be another tour. But in any event, so with this kind of barren landscape here in the old farm fields, you can imagine like what a dramatic sight that was when it burned. Fortunately, I guess, Oliver Dean had died the year before, so he didn't have to witness that, to see the beloved academy that he had founded go down in flames. But it didn't go down in flames for long, obviously. We're here. And the people that came to the rescue were the Ray family, the industrialists. So they donated the money. It was about $100,000 to get the building rebuilt. I don't know how many millions of dollars that would be today. Quite a lot.
Exorbitant.
Yeah, and I suspect you wouldn't get it as cheaply then now as you do then.
Yes.
But in any event, they rebuilt. And they rebuilt, if you flip over to number 9, you'll notice that it's a different architectural style. So they used the same plans. The plans were fine. So that's why the layout of the windows and the general structure, the footprint of the building didn't change. But they did go for a different architectural style. The original, these sort of curved roofs like you see on the Ray house, on the admissions house, that's known as mansard. And perhaps you've seen that. It's very popular like in France, and that's where the inspiration came from. And then they went for what you see here, this kind of more pointy. This is neo-Gothic. And that was the choice that they made in the rebuild. But even still, you'll notice something quite different. We don't have a tower anymore. There's no cross up there. And that was a product of, which some of you will know, the hurricane of 1938, back before they gave hurricanes names. And the hurricane of 38 came storming up the East Coast. If you go to Providence, Rhode Island, you'll see in the downtown buildings they have some copper plaques of the water line during the storm surge of the hurricane of 38. It's pretty high up, like around here. Even up here, this far inland, the storm was enormously destructive. The tower was blown off the building. It landed in the courtyard back behind toward Perry Gym. We have some photographs of that wreckage. We also have some silent film of them cleaning it up. We've got some really interesting silent film footage of the faculty out here with tree limbs brushing the sidewalks, and everybody kind of pitched in. Dean didn't get the worst of it. The Baptist church over on School Street, like the whole building collapsed in the storm. So there was quite a lot of damage around here. So that's when we lost the tower and the little cupolas that were on either end. But you'll also see in this image that, as I mentioned before, this is where we had all the athletics back in those days. And so Grant Field wasn't yet developed. That would come along in the early 1900s. We didn't have Longley Field or the Longley Complex yet. So all the athletics happened out here, along with other things. But you can see in that photo, you already noticed the tennis courts, or the tennis nets that were there. And then you'll see there's a game of baseball being played with the home plate right over, somewhere over this way. And you'll also notice the goalposts for football. And so you can just imagine all these exciting like sports happening out here on the front campus. I'm going to come back to number 9 in a moment. Speaking of the sports though, I wanted to get a little of that. If you flip over to number 10, This is a photo I love. I remember the first time I found this back in 2005, and we had all of our storage, historical storage, in the lower level of the campus center. And I was going through this box, and I pulled out this photo of the baseball team, and it was just like, wow. The guy on the, what is that, the right? It looks like he walked right off a Civil War battlefield, right? Like, he's like, well, I survived Antietam, and now I'm going to go to Dean. Let me tell you about Gettysburg. A lot of people from this town fought in the Civil War, of course. There's a nice monument down on the town common for them. But I love that photo of the baseball team. And that photo would have been taken right at that doorway. You can still see the steps, right? Yep. And the granite. Yep. So just hold that up and think of those guys. Like 1868, 1870 maybe? I don't have a specific date on this, but it would have been around that time. So that's really something to think about. If you flip it over, some other sports figures, one of the people that ran around out here was Richard Perry Williams, R.P. Williams. He scored 46 touchdowns for the football team. He also captained the ice hockey team to an undefeated season. He was one of the fastest people to ever live. He recorded multiple record 100-yard dashes. And if any of you know Jim Thorpe, the great American athlete, Richard Perry Williams bested Jim Thorpe in the decathlon events that they competed in. And Jim Thorpe said that he's the fastest sprinter that ever lived. That all sounds really impressive. That's not the most impressive thing that R.P. Williams did. He got into playing handball, which I don't know much about, but it's like racquetball, I understand. He played handball in Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. Between 1910 and 1930, he won 14,657 handball matches. He didn't just win 14,657 handball matches. He won 14,657 in a row. Most of them by 21-0. I think R.P. Williams might be one of the greatest athletes that's ever lived. And like, nobody knows about him. He went to Ohio and he worked in a town called Miamisburg, which is north of Cincinnati. He coached their high school teams there. He won like 20 state championships, like coaching their high school teams in Miami, like crazy. Just crazy, and like hardly anybody knows about him. So I'm on a campaign to work with our athletics department to do something to acknowledge R.P. Williams. He was actually born in England, and he immigrated here as a boy, but definitely like the greatest athlete in Dean history, and I think maybe in American history. We also had women's sports, though, as you can see by the uniforms of the Dean ladies basketball team from 1907. I think fashion was a little more important than function when you look at those, but they played their games in the old gym, which you see there. And speaking of women's sports, the woman golfer standing in front of the old gym, we're about next to where that tree has grown up, that's Cora F. Adams. So any of you who've lived in Adams Hall, yes, that's her. Yep. She was a longtime instructor here and a pioneering women's golfer. So our athletics history, I think, is really quite fascinating. But you can look up R.P. Williams on the internet. I hope you do. And you'll see his record in the handball and his sub-9 second 100-yard dashes and all of that crazy stuff that he did. Since we're here, we can flip back to image number 9, and that is Oppie Purse. And if you look right behind you, as many of you know, this sidewalk is Oppie Way. So what's up with that? So Arthur Winslow Purse, who our science building is also named for, you'll see Arthur W. Purse, but he had a nice nickname, Oppie. It was A.W. Purse, so they just called him Oppie. He came to Franklin in the 1890s and became very civically engaged. He helped found the Franklin Country Club. He was president of the Library Association. He helped found the Ben Franklin Savings Bank, which is where the Rockland Trust is now. He was highly engaged. Speaking of engaged, he did something that a lot of men have done over the years to propel themselves to fame and fortune. When he got to town, he looked for the richest family and married their daughter. Ben Franklin did that, Andrew Jackson did that. Like, this is very typical. Like, get to town, find the rich people, marry their daughter. That's what Arthur W. Purse did. So he got to live in the mansion right there where Woodward Hall is, the one that burned down in the 90s. He was the headmaster of Dean Academy for almost 40 years. So every morning he would walk across our fields to his office in Dean Hall, and in the evening he would go back. And he did that for decades, and he wore a path right down through the middle of the football field. So in the 19 teens, he'd been doing this for like 15 or more years. The students wanted to recognize that. So they donated money to build the arch, and then they built the sidewalk, and this became Oppie Way. And so that's what we've had now for over 100 years. And so when we walk here, we're walking in the footsteps of Oppie. And you see him right there with his German Shepherd. And he's standing right about there, right? Yeah. In front of the Rey Building. And that was our original science building that his wife, Lydia, the one who you saw in the carriage, that was his wife. She and her sister had donated the money in 1903 to build our original science building. I should also mention of Lydia Ray. She wasn't just an important wife to Oppie and an important philanthropist. She's actually the first woman of Franklin to get a college degree. She went to Dean Academy and got basically like her high school diploma, and then she went to Vassar College in New York and earned her baccalaureate degree. So Lydia was our first woman college graduate, philanthropist, and spouse to Oppie Purse. As we stand here, there also have been some pretty significant gatherings that have happened on this space. So you got R.P. Williams running touchdowns around everybody. You got Oppie Purse walking back and forth. You got Cora Adams out here knocking golf balls around. And in 1916, the 50th commencement exercises, Dean had the privilege of having 2 presidents in attendance for commencement. The first was a former president, William Howard Taft, and you'll see him right above the American flag bunting, speaking to the assembly of the commencement crowd. We do our commencements out here on the front campus. There was a long period of time where we did them back on Grant Field, but we have returned to this tradition. So we can stand right here where President Taft gave his commencement address to the class of 1916. Also in attendance was Massachusetts Lieutenant Governor, future President Calvin Coolidge. So if we had this today, this would be like having like George Bush or Barack Obama, and then whoever's going to be president like 6 years from now. So somebody start making some phone calls. Commencement's coming in May. These people have busy calendars. And somebody get a crystal ball and find out who's going to be president 6 or 8 years from now. But if you can do all that, we can recreate 1916 in many ways. So that was a really special commencement. 2 years after that, the next photograph, number 13, taken right out here. And the building that you see in the center behind the trees, that is the second of the mansions that became known as Purse House, because in those sort of like patriarchal days, they named it for Oppie Purse. That's the building that burned in the 90s. But that crowd is, well, it's 1918. There's a crowd of people. Any guesses what this crowd is? What they're doing? I mean, this was not safe for them, by the way. This was during the 1918 influenza pandemic, which was ravaging Massachusetts. So not very safe for them to gather this way. But anybody know what they were doing in 1918? Yeah, it's World War I related. It was a war bond rally. So they were buying war bonds to support the war effort. And these were very typical. One of these war bond rallies, particularly in Philadelphia that year, became a massive super spreader event for the Spanish flu. And this was devastating. I could tell stories of how this community, we did a blog on it. If anybody wants to know more about Dean in the 1918 pandemic, we did an article in the Dean magazine 8 months ago, and we did a blog on it as well. So I'd be happy to share how this community survived, and not everybody survived, but how this community lived through that. So that's the war bond rally. Photograph taken probably from what, like the third story of Dean Hall there. All right, let's move a little bit. Let's go over this way. We only have a few minutes left, but I'm going to squeeze it all in. I pointed out a little bit ago that this is the Rey Building, and you can see the name there. You remember how the daughters loved Italy? That's why they use the Latin alphabet. So a lot of times students ask, why does it say building? I'm like, well, in Latin, the V and the U are interchangeable, so it's not building or a typo, but they really loved Italy. So they represent that. But anyway, inside this was the original science building. Today it's classrooms and other things, but it had our original theater. And that's the photo that you see on page 14. The theater was in the top level. That space is actually still there. It doesn't look like this, but it's like an attic, and it's stripped down, but the space still physically exists. I mentioned this theater because we have so many amazing alumni, right? R.P. Williams is one of them. Lydia Ray is another. But if any of you ever saw the 1951 film All the King's Men, or if you watched that 50s TV show Highway Patrol, you might know the actor Broderick Crawford. And he won the Oscar for All the King's Men in 1951, so he is our Oscar Award winner. And he was a student here in the early 1930s. And he learned to act right up there. He's got 2 stars on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, 1 for television, 1 for film. And he also starred as Lenny in Of Mice and Men on Broadway. Yeah, so that was where Broderick Crawford got his start, right up in our old theater. Of course, today we have the main stage, and it's lovely, and hopefully you can go to a performance there. As I'm standing here over my shoulder, you will see the Dean Hall parking lot. On page 15, you see a different photograph of the Dean Hall parking lot. Back when tennis was really popular here, that was where the tennis courts were. So now we all park our cars there. And we'll wrap up here with Dean Hall, a couple of images of Dean Hall. The first one is from the 4th floor. And that is a student's dormitory in 1899. And I love this picture because the student handbook from those days says that students shall not excessively decorate their rooms. But I don't think they enforced that. I also think that the students then had very sticky fingers. Look at what they've decorated with. Like advertisements that they've stolen from businesses down on Main Street. So some things don't really change that much. Like people like to hang street signs and things. There used to be a drivable lane that was in a big U shape here on the front campus. You used to be able to drive right up to Dean Hall. You see that in photo number 17. This is from the 1940s, and some of the young ladies in school getting dropped off or picked up here at right out in front of Dean Hall there. That's a fun one to think about. And then just a couple of other quick ones. The library that you see on page 18, photo 18, that was right behind this wall where our digital media studios are today. And in fact, if you go into the office of Professor Siebert, who's one of the digital media professors, you'll still see some beautiful, like marble carved mantelpiece from that library. That's been preserved. So you can go see Professor Siebert and check out that beautiful marble. But that was our library, where you recent students and alumni always would go to pay your bills and get your transcripts. The Student Financial Planning Office. That is photo number 19. So I would encourage you to go in sometime into those spaces with these photos and be like, oh wow, like that's the business office. But that's where they all used to have their collective meals. In fact, when the tower fell down off the building in 1938 during the storm, all the faculty and students were in the dining room there, right beneath the tower. So it was a pretty trepidatious moment, lots of sweaty palms, people wondering were they going to be okay. But everybody, like I said, no one was hurt, at least at Dean. A couple other quick hits. The lower level, we used to have a lot of domestic science courses here, or what was, when I was a kid, called home ec. And these were primarily, as you might guess, in those very gendered days, very much for the female students. They had cooking classes, sewing classes, among the domestic science curriculum. So they would do that right down in the lower level. They had these labs. And then you see the grand staircase, number 21. This was a great tradition back in the earlier days. Around Christmas time, they'd have these wassail parties, these holiday parties, and they'd all dress up in this sort of Renaissance garb, and they'd get all candles going in the trophy room in Mem Hall, and they'd have great feasts for the holidays. Yeah, I think we should totally bring this back. We should bring this back. It'd be a lot of fun.